Hello, welcome. My name is Agustina Giraudy. I am an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. And welcome again to this event on democratic backsliding and new technologies. Before kicking it off, I would like to thank Kate Arian for helping us organize this event. And I also wanted to go over some of the logistics of today's conversation. So first of all, the discussion will last for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, we please ask you to submit it through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window. And closed captioning is now available for those who need it. So please click on the option also at the bottom of your screens. We please ask you that no one record this session, and we will record it for you, and it will be available on the SIS YouTube channel after this event. So I wanted to start with a very few introduction about the topic and just say that we currently live in an era of democratic backsliding, which is affecting both countries in the global north and the global south. There is also increasing scholarly evidence that suggests that online platforms and new technologies are contributing to this process of democratic erosion. And so in this webinar, we're going to try to unpack how new technologies are affecting democratic backsliding. But in particular, we would like to focus beyond the dominant discussion, which is about the role of new technologies during elections. Democracy is way more than elections. And so we would like to try to understand better how these new technologies are affecting some very fundamental rights, such as civil, political, and very basic human rights in between elections. Another deliberate goal that we have in this conversation is to move beyond the US. And so we will try to understand how these things are happening beyond this country. So today I have the pleasure of talking, and actually all of you have the pleasure to listen to three very influential and knowledgeable people who are working on these issues. Each of them are working from different angles, and we thought that in this panel we would have people from academia and think tanks so that we can have a thorough understanding of what's going on when we think about new technologies and democratic erosion. So let me briefly introduce them. We have with us Dr. Samantha Bradshaw, who is an assistant professor in new technology and security at SIS at American University. She has joined us very recently, so it is a great honor for us to have her here. We have Kian Vesteinsson, who is a senior research analyst of technology and democracy at Freedom House. So thank you so much for all the great work that you do there. And finally, we have Daniel Arnaudo, who is a senior advisor for information strategies and technology and innovation at the National Democratic Institute, the NDI. So thank you all for being here. And I hope that we have a fruitful and interesting conversation on this very important topic. So I would like to start with Dr. Bradshaw, and I would like to pose two questions. So I'll do the same thing for each of the panelists. And the first one is related to your work. In your work, you're focused on the negative effects on online platforms and social mobilization and minority social movements. And we wanted to know what are some of the main findings in this area of study, and in particular, what have you found in your research? And the second question is about what are some of the tools that academia, practitioners, and some governments are using to counterbalance some of these harmful effects that you are finding in your research. So the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Agustina. I'm just going to get my screen share going here since I have some slides that hopefully we'll answer some of your questions too as I'm going through them. Awesome. Yeah, so thank you again. I'm going to focus my remarks today on disinformation and social movements. As Agustina mentioned in her opening remarks, we kind of want to shift the conversation away from elections. Elections are an important part of disinformation and democracy, and thinking about the role of social media platforms and these digital technologies in the information space and kind of what that's doing to our democracy writ large. But there's lots of stuff that happens in between that affects citizens' rights and our ability to mobilize and protest. And so today I'm going to focus my remarks on that issue. And I wanted to start off, since I'm the first person going here, just talking about what digital disinformation actually is and what's actually new here, because disinformation, foreign influence operations, fake news, all of this stuff isn't necessarily new. It's been around for as long as people have been trying to convince one another of something. But I think social media changes the scale, the scope, and the reach of these kinds of messaging strategies and campaigns in very important ways for democracy, elections, and social movements. And so as the first speaker, I just kind of wanted to lay this foundational kind of knowledge for the audience. So what's actually new? First, algorithms. Unlike in the past where we had, more traditional gatekeepers of news and information, platforms now do that. And they often do that through their algorithms that are tailoring content, often based on virality opposed to veracity. So things that generate engagement is what tends to spread on social media because that's how they generate advertising revenue and keep people on the platforms. So high quality information might not necessarily be prioritized in this digital information ecosystem. Second, anonymity plays a big role here. We tend to know, from in the past who is spreading information, where it's coming from. Now, with a bunch of the digital affordances, it's very easy for people to mask who they actually are. And this has implications for, foreign state actors who might be creating fake accounts, posing as Americans or posing as different citizens and pretending to have a certain stance on a political issue. Sometimes it's not even real people behind the accounts, but bots and automation is another important factor here. Bots are essentially pieces of code that are designed to mimic human behavior. They'll do things like, share, retweet pieces of content, and they can amplify certain kinds of narratives or certain kinds of people, make voices at the fringe seem much louder than they actually are. And then the final kind of key feature around what's new that I'd like to highlight for you all is the role of data. We have so much more data available about people and about users, and this data can be used to target specific messages to specific kinds of people or groups of people through digital platforms. So we can send them messages that already align with their pre-existing ideas, their values, their beliefs, or we can send them things that disalign in order to make them more angry and enraged at politics and the state of the world. So these are kind of 4 features that I think are really, really new that are changing our democracy and the information environment in really important ways. So I want to move now on to discussing the role of democracy and social movements, because social media has also enhanced the ability for people to mobilize and to protest in really, really important ways. It's so essential now for recruiting activists and other participants to movements, creating a hashtag and generating that momentum to get people to participate in your movement is foundational to mobilization in today's day and age. It's very rare that we see very successful social movements that don't have a digital element. At the same time as recruiting participants, these technologies are really important for coordinating actual mobilization. They're used to set times and dates for, showing up with actual protest signs and putting bodies and feet to the streets. And finally, it's not just local anymore, but these movements can be very global because of social media. They can reach kind of beyond the national borders of the states and have participation from around the world. So, Me Too is an example of that. The protests and mobilizationing happening in Iran right now is another example of, these very kind of successful campaigns that use hashtags, that recruit globally, that coordinate meetings and activities all through and via this digital medium. But just as these technologies can enhance protest and mobilization, they're also a double-edged sword, and they can also, at the same time, be used to stifle protest and mobilization. So I'm going to highlight 3 ways in which I see the stifling of these activities happening via disinformation. And the first point is that social media is often used and disinformation is often used to harass political activists and the leaders of particular movements. So we often see individuals targeted with online harassment or other threats of violence that can seep into the real world. And this kind of harassment is much more severe for women, people of color, people with diverse gender identities, those with disabilities, and other minority communities. A lot of research and studies show that if you have any kind of intersectional identity and you're experiencing harassment, it tends to be much longer and much more pronounced than if you fit within more, singular identity groups. And this is something that has really measurable and really chilling effects for online political participation and expression. Other studies have shown that individuals who have experienced online harassment, they tend to post less, they tend to share less, they tend to engage less on social media. And so downstream, this can have real effects on people's ability to lead social movements, to participate in them, and to lay some of these, some of this foundational work that makes our democracies vibrant. The second, I think, issue that arises as a result of disinformation, democracy, social movements is the role of polarization. We often see foreign state actors using social movements and their messages as a way to polarize audiences. So in the United States, for example, race has been a huge issue that has been weaponized by foreign influence operations and by Russian foreign influence operations. We've seen states, and Russia in particular, take the Black Lives Matter movement and play both sides. So they are both, pro Black Lives Matter and pro police, and they use these 2 frames to push people further and further away from the middle. And this can really limit social movements' ability to recruit new members and to control the narrative. Just to give you a couple of examples of what this actually looks like. So the 2 screen captures on the left are from Russian state-backed media, both covering this protest march through Stone Park Mountain. You can see RTs framing. They talk about heavily armed Black protesters just marching through Stone Mountain Park. Redfish, which is another Russian state-backed media outlet, talks about, Black armed militias, and they're protesting against white supremacist groups like the KKK. So there's kind of 2 slightly different frames discussing the exact same event. So this is kind of an example of what that polarization looks like in practice and how they kind of play both sides of the issue, speaking to different kinds of audiences with different kinds of sensibilities. And then on the right, this is just an example from some of the early IRA campaigns around the US 2016, oh my gosh, it's so long ago now, 2016 elections, where you can see they're just kind of talking about race here to, again, use that as a wedge to get people kind of angry and anxious and focusing on these issues. And then finally, my third point here is that disinformation can undermine people's sense of collective identity. And collective identity is something that's really, really important to social movements. It's really a necessary precondition to mobilization because people need to have a common and shared sense of identity to come together and to protest or to mobilize around what that identity, that shared identity actually is. We've also seen Russian interference target this sense of collective identity making in social movements. For example, during the women's marches in 2017 and 2018, it wasn't about pushing different sides of the issue like it was with the Black Lives Matter content, but it was actually about demobilizing the movement from within. And so what I mean by that, here's just three kind of examples of tweets that we saw Russian operatives sharing. So they described feminism as being, too white for women of color. They described it as being too liberal for conservative women or too wealthy for poor women. And this was a way of kind of fracturing the different groups of people and women who might want to relate to this movement and participate and mobilize. And so it was about demobilizing them from within, opposed to, again, that kind of what we see around the Black Lives Matter movement, where it's about polarizing Black Americans against white Americans and pushing people apart that way. And so just to kind of wrap this up, without a shared sense of identity, these movements, they really can't get off the ground because that's really the core starting place for social mobilization. Agustina asked me to kind of wrap up with some policy considerations of where I think the solution to some of these issues actually is, what we can do about it. I'd like to put forward two things. The first is that, I think, first of all, we need more platform transparency. It's really hard to measure the effect that disinformation has on social movements and our ability to protest without good data from platform companies. Right now, it's very hard and it's increasingly getting harder. There's a lot more walls going up around academic data access. Twitter, which used to be the most open platform, is now, who knows what's going to happen with the future of Twitter. Facebook is and Meta are increasingly closing opportunities for data access. So I think that's one huge area that's going to make a big difference policy-wise, because we need to understand the problem and the scope and the scale of it before we can make informed policy recommendations that are actually going to deal with the key issues here. And the second point, and kind of related, is that, I think we need to really design our policy around these studies that are empirically informed. There's, an emerging body of work on polarization that's showing, the effects of correcting information and when to do it and why to do it and how those kinds of strategies can reduce polarization. And so I think looking to the academics who are doing different studies around different topics are going to be really, really important, and having more of that collaboration happen between academia and platforms. I don't necessarily see a role for government here. I think as soon as government steps into the picture, it becomes very politicized. I should say I don't see the role for government in moderating content. I think government has a role to play for, informing transparency and all that kind of stuff. But there have been a lot of calls to, regulate fake news. And I think those are more problematic responses and don't necessarily get to the heart of some of these issues and some of the reasons why disinformation can undermine democracy more broadly. So I will wrap up there and give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. So now I'd like to turn to Kian Vesteinsson, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, even though I tried before this event. And I wanted to focus on your work, the work that you do at Freedom House, that it's basically on how online platforms and internet regulations are eroding other key aspects of democracy, such as the curtailment of civil, political, and other vital human rights. And I would like you to reflect a little bit on what you have found at Freedom House, and finally, if you can, in the same vein as Sam, provide us with some toolkits or some recommendations that we can give to governments or other actors who are relying extensively on these platforms.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, and great work on the name. And it's a pleasure to follow Dr. Bradshaw's comments here. Just by way of background of where I'm coming from on this, I work for Freedom House on our Freedom on the Net report, which is our annual country-by-country assessment of internet freedom around the world. And we define this as the simple idea that the rights and protections we enjoy offline should also be protected online. We're really fundamentally looking at the real world experiences of people in a given country who are accessing the internet. And that's what I want to dive into here within this framework of talking about democracy and democratic decline. For Freedom on the Net, we examined 70 countries, which translates to roughly 89% of the world's internet population. Our companion report that Freedom House produces, the Freedom in the World report, has found 16 years of consecutive decline in political rights and civil liberties around the world. Our reporting has found 12 years of consecutive decline of internet freedom. And as Agustina said, these trends are fundamentally related. I want to take as a starting point the idea that social media platforms are one of the primary venues for democratic participation. This is probably not so controversial in this day and age, but fundamentally, these platforms are where many people around the world turn to learn about critical issues, express dissent, and, as Dr. Bradshaw laid out, to mobilize social movements. And governments know this. There's a whole host of steps that governments around the world have taken to undermine human rights online. These are the planks of democracy in the digital age: free expression, access to information, privacy, other human rights. And this is what I want to spend some time on today in my remarks. So the most extreme measure that we see here is full-on restrictions on access to the internet, or to the social media platforms that serve as the de facto internet for many people around the world. Authorities turn to such restrictions often in times of potential political transition. Take Zambia, for instance, where the government briefly shut down social media platforms on the day of polling in August 2021. This didn't work. For the record, the then President Lungu lost that election, and the incoming, the new president has made some really powerful commitments to protecting internet access. But there's other measures that are often less intrusive or more covert that governments use to undermine human rights online and to endanger essentially democratic participation in their countries. So Dr. Bradshaw spoke with some real insights on, as I understood it, foreign influence operations on social media. What I want to turn to here is looking at platform manipulation in domestic contexts. Our research has found that pro-government commentators manipulate domestic online discussions in 49 of the 70 countries that we cover. That amounts to, as you see here, about 69% of the world's internet users living in countries where governments are proactively seeking to manipulate online discussions to favor their narratives. This looks very different depending on the context. A couple of key examples here: the Philippines. We saw in May that the Philippines had a general election, a real generational election. And parties across the political spectrum invested in disinformation for hire firms ahead of those elections and during the election season. Generally, these firms sell services from the top down. They're providing high-level strategy from PR and ad executives. They're providing posts from influencers, popular social media accounts, and then they're providing accounts who boost those posts to distribute this narrative online. This was increasingly common in the Philippines and very likely shaped the views of some voters. And this is particularly the case with regard to the rehabilitation of now President Bongbong Marcos, whose father is the right-wing dictator Ferdinand Marcos. The elder Marcos presided over decades of corruption and rights abuses while ruling the country. And what we saw during the election season in the Philippines is that these online information networks mobilized to spread positive messaging about the Marcoses, calling them familial, comforting, good fathers, all of this sorts of content that really meaningfully shifted online discussion about the candidates. There's also more overt efforts to manipulate pro-government narratives. Take Venezuela, where the government has long invested in these sort of efforts to manipulate the online sphere. Venezuelan authorities have created multiple technical systems that coordinate platform manipulation, both domestic Venezuelan platforms and international social media platforms. One really pernicious example here is the Patria system, which on the one hand is how Venezuelans access public benefits, but also has an interface for sort of gamified posting to post messages that support the Maduro government. These have undoubtedly helped favor the Maduro government in Venezuela's recent what we might call competitive authoritarian elections. These are really shaping public discourse around what people in Venezuela believe on social media. Now, one thing I want to flag here is that governments are seeing this sort of trend of misinformation spreading online, and in response, increasingly asserting their authority over technology platforms through new laws. It's certainly true that the sort of laissez-faire approach to the tech industry has created opportunities for all kinds of harms, from the sort of electoral interference that we've talked about, all the way down to targeted harassment that may lead to serious offline violence. And so governments have stepped up to the plate, and some of these moves are, reflecting legitimate attempts to mitigate these online harms, to rein in manipulative market practices or data misuse. But many governments around the world are using this trend of backlash against technology companies to force these businesses to comply with undue censorship and surveillance, which is undermining democratic participation and human rights online even further in these countries. For instance, governments in India, Turkey, Bangladesh, many others have passed or drafted laws that require social media platforms to remove broad categories of speech without court orders. These provisions make it much easier for political leaders to censor political dissent and investigative reporting, which are some of the core planks of democratic discourse online. Without people expressing themselves freely, without journalists reporting on the government, we're going to see even further democratic deterioration around the world. We've also seen that governments have retaliated against technology platforms that are trying to mitigate these online harms that we've discussed. Brazil's now former President Bolsonaro, for instance, signed new rules back in September 2021 that would have kept social media platforms from removing content that violated their own terms of service or other platform policies. This is really serious, and this effort took place, just months before Brazil's elections, where Bolsonaro and his allies were on the ballot. And civil society in Brazil rightly condemned these rules as an attempt to permit Bolsonaro and his supporters to spread more disinformation online ahead of the election. Ultimately, and thankfully, the Supreme Court and the Senate in Brazil nullified those rules about a week later. So they did not, in fact, take effect because of some really powerful mobilization within Brazil. One other example that I think is really important to think about here is in Nigeria, where the government blocked Twitter for something like 7 months after the platform removed a post from President Muhammadu Buhari's account in June 2021. Buhari had tweeted something that essentially comprised a veiled threat of violence against the Biafran secessionist movement in Nigeria, and Twitter said, we don't allow this from significant political figures. we can put a pin in that and return to that in the Q&A, because I think content moderation of political leaders in these contexts of democratic backsliding is one of the hot topics of the day, and certainly happy to return to it. But what we saw in Nigeria is that the government took this as an attack against the Nigerian government and blocked Twitter. The government only unblocked Twitter in January of 2022, then stating that Twitter had agreed to set up a physical presence in the country and comply with some other concessions. For the record, Twitter hasn't publicly acknowledged agreeing to these conditions. We don't really know the landscape of what that looks like. And certainly, it's all very murky right now. I don't think we're going to get much clarity anytime soon on what Twitter and the Nigerian government had agreed to. But what I'm getting at here is that governments around the world are seeing opportunities to leverage sanctions against the platforms that people turn to for democratic participation in their countries when those platforms are trying to maintain the integrity of online discourse. And that's a real serious problem. Now, I'll turn to here, maybe the flip side, the things that we've seen that are positive and what governments and companies should be doing here. So I don't sound like I'm, a harbinger of doom. I do want to highlight some really positive stories we've seen over the past year or so of democratic resilience taking place on social media. People still turn to social media platforms in really serious ways to mobilize. One of the reasons why the sort of current chaos around Twitter is very scary is because this platform is so fundamentally a place that social movements around the world turn to. I mean, Twitter is less data intensive than other apps. It's entirely text-based. It has all of these sort of design choices that folks turn to in the global South to mobilize, and we're seeing a sort of disinvestment in those very parts of the company that supported users in the global South and trust and safety and civic integrity more broadly. And so certainly I think watching what happens with Twitter is one of the big questions in this broader conversation about democratic decline and social media. But I promise good news. We've seen in Sri Lanka that Sri Lankans took to social media to mobilize really historic protests starting in March 2022, calling for broad reforms to the country's political culture. This began online in the spring and then turned into a mass social movement where people took to the streets to call for change, and ultimately saw some resignations from the sort of ruling Rajapaksa family, and people are still taking to social media to call for change. And then in Zambia, I mentioned those social media platforms during the elections. A Zambian human rights organization, the Chapter 1 Foundation, sued the communications regulator over this social media block and won a concession from the regulator that has now pledged not to act outside of its legal authority and committed to improving transparency regarding internet or social media restrictions, which is a really important and rare sort of concession coming from a communications regulator. We've also seen companies like Twitter and Facebook investing in platform integrity ahead of elections in recent years. Facebook, for instance, launched collaborations with civil society and stepped up investments in content moderation ahead of the elections in Brazil, as well as elections in Kenya. And this is a really critical baseline thing for social media companies to do. Companies need to heed the calls from academics, from civil society, to invest more in experts who understand the languages and socio-political contexts of the markets that we're talking about today. We've seen a chronic underinvestment in the sort of critical democracies in the global South, these places where people use these platforms to raise their voices and mobilize. Platforms need to step this up. This is true of the platforms that we think of as sort of the giants, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, but it's also true of newer platforms. We've seen many new platforms on the rise recently, like TikTok. I'll say that, generally speaking, it's a good thing to have more platforms. Diversity is really good. When we see people being able to access a diverse market of online services through smaller platforms that are tailored towards the needs of a particular community or audience, we see a more resilient information environment. But these newer companies don't need to reinvent the wheel. They should learn from the mistakes and lessons learned of this first wave of Web 2.0 platforms, particularly around how these platforms have taken steps to mitigate online harms and protect human rights online. As for governments, here I'll largely agree with what Dr. Bradshaw identified. It's really important that regulators work to prioritize transparency in regulation that governs technology companies and the internet. And when we talk about transparency, we mean across core products and practices, right? Everything from content moderation to automated recommendation systems, and everything that goes into how companies collect and use data. And of course, providing vetted researchers, access to these platform data is a really critical component of that. Finally, I'll flag the regulatory environment. Particularly here in the US, we've seen a long underinvestment in capacity to regulate these industries. Governments, including here in the US, should empower privacy and competition regulators to step in to ensure better practices by these companies and take that sort of lessons learned from greater platform transparency and embed that into regulatory structures. Finally, I'll urge governments to really invest in what we call digital resiliency. All of these ways that civil society and academics are pushing to make our internet spaces better. Governments can do that, can support that by embedding internet freedom in their democracy programming, working with trusted researchers to inform policy decision-making. There's a whole world of expertise that governments can pull from as they're seeking to make their policy. I'll close there, really looking forward to diving into any of this and to hearing from Dan. Thanks.
Thank you, Kian. And now moving to our last panelist today, Daniel. So most of your work, I think among all of the three presenters here, you are the one who has done a lot of work on electoral interference and election, which is this other aspect of democracy that we wanted to move beyond from, but that we are still addressing in this conversation. And so Kian was also talking about how companies have adapted and become a little bit better when it comes to elections, but bad actors have readapted as well, and they have become more sophisticated. So if you could give us a general idea of how the field of electoral interference is at, that would be great. And also if you can reflect a little bit on how governments and civil society and academia can think about strategies to prevent democracies from eroding in the pace that they are eroding today.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you for having me. And I think my points are definitely complementary to the other speakers. We'll be talking some about kind of how we want to democratize the info space and our approach at NDI, and talk about some of the cases actually that have already been discussed, particularly in Brazil and Nigeria. Just to give you an overview for those who aren't so familiar, NDI is a global organization that is one of the core institutes, the National Endowment for Democracy, along with the Center for International Private Enterprise, International Republican Institute, which is our colleagues on the Republican side, and Solidarity, which work with unions. So we work all over the world. We have offices in over 60 countries and programs in many more. And we work particularly with local CSOs and other organizations, other parties. We have an exchange with the House Democracy Partnership and other parliaments around the world. And focusing on technology, our team works. I work for the Democracy and Technology team, and we are particularly focusing on ICT issues within democratic processes. We're also kind of leading an initiative we call Infotegrity that includes building responses on countering disinformation, hate speech, and other harmful forms of content worldwide. And we're really looking to develop networks and talk about, taking a holistic approach to these issues, which is something I'm going to talk about, and at least our approach, and I think many others in the space, and how that works. I think these are things that, the other speakers have gone over a fair amount. Certainly I think the exponential power of these networks is having an effect online, and particularly when they are motivated by state-sponsored actors, either motivated by them or organized by them. I think that really changes the nature. So you see, when you can dedicate those kinds of resources, and in the case of certain governments, even centrally control the networks. Let's take Chinese social networks, where all those things Dr. Bradshaw was talking about in terms of controlling algorithms, controlling large shares of data about your users, and being able to manipulate what they see on a system-wide level, I think really changes the game. But in terms of democratic context, I think what you're seeing is not only what we understand, I think, fairly well, even in the U.S. context, where campaigns and parties and politicians and their allies are manipulating people to vote one way or another, or to take one perspective or another. I think you're also seeing, really something that is attacking the elections and democratic institutions more broadly, questioning democratic systems, questioning the validity of them, asking whether there are better ways of organizing, whether potentially more authoritarian systems are more viable. And these can take on all these different aspects that have been discussed in terms of manipulating social divisions. I think particularly, targeting different demographics, talking about people's gender and using radicalizing themes. And I think in different cases you see this play out in local context that changes the way that people are talking about it and using these local situations to talk about specific themes, but oftentimes they follow a lot of the same patterns. And we see this repeatedly in different places where we work. We've developed a guide, it's counteringdisinformation.org, that looks at all these different contexts and begins to talk about what can we do to respond. And it has sections that address different roles for democratic partners. So election management bodies are a key one, like the Federal Election Commission in the United States. There are others internationally that I think provide a central role in coordinating around these issues, both ahead of, during, and then after elections in terms of reporting the results, as you're seeing now across the United States, where different election management bodies on a state level even are coordinating with federal groups. You're also seeing the role of election observers, how they can play a more engaged role in civil society. More broadly, as well as the platforms, which I think was spoken about well in the past conversation, and then thinking about different kinds of responses in terms of research, in terms of legal and normative frameworks. And so we talk through these different themes and also include a large database of interventions globally that included both programmatic interventions, but also legal and other approaches, and also thinking some about the gender dimensions of disinformation overall. And so this was coordinated through the CEPS consortium. It's a consortium of NDI, International Republican Institute, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and is bolstered by research we did in Colombia, Indonesia, and Ukraine. And it's something that we use to train our partners to talk about these different issues. I think, the parties aspect is one I think is particularly significant as well, and how they play a role in both inflaming or potentially protecting the democratic system by playing by the rules or by breaking them in different ways. So we talk a fair amount about approaches you can take working with them. And as we are ourselves a party institute, this is a component of our work. And then, thinking through some of the different kinds of normative responses that we can take, whether there are, more developed standards that either individuals can take or parties or, even governments and kind of supranational systems. You also want to look at, I think, and understand kind of the regulatory aspect that was discussed some. So there's sections on all these different aspects. Just to kind of dig into it a little bit and talk some about the platforms piece, which I think was well discussed. You want to look at, not only kind of the policies and the interventions with products that limit the spread of disinformation, but you also want to look at ways that you can provide access to more authoritative information, and then broader efforts to develop media literacy or digital literacy, improve internet access, and think about how you can build that societal response on a deeper level. These examples here, I think you can see, from the last presidential election. This is one of the, or this is a little bit before the presidential election, but I think was part of a process that eventually got former President Trump removed from the platform, where first his tweets were flagged, as you can see here. And this is a kind of intervention in the product, right? And eventually, where he was discrediting the election itself, he was removed from the platform. And I think that went a long way to establishing the standard that, say, got President Buhari removed from the platform and then Twitter banned in Nigeria, because that established the precedent, that you could remove political leaders from the platform, and that it was no longer something where it was in the public interest to keep them online. And so, you look at those kinds of responses and how you can develop them. And then, you have kind of voter information data. This is kind of an example of how you can share positive information and coordinate with the election management body on sharing that information about where to vote and how. So these are some examples of platform responses. I think, we've discussed some of the regulatory aspects in the past, but, thinking about different modalities around building transparency, equity in the process, not only about restricting content and behaviors, which I think is kind of some of the most problematic, and thinking about whether you're working on, kind of the domestic piece and working on regulating parties or politicians and what they say, or whether you work with the social media and the technology companies themselves and regulating them. So you can take different pieces of that and different approaches. The normative piece, I think, I talked a little bit about looking at, not only broader norms that we have for cybersecurity, internet governance, but also thinking through, how you develop specific codes around disinformation, around hate speech and content online, particularly for the private sector, and where you won't necessarily have legal approaches, certainly that work in an international way, but you may have codes that can work transnationally. To regulate how platforms are operating and what is acceptable behavior. At the same time, you want to look particularly at parties and how you can set up codes for them, and how you can work with specific individuals, such as journalists or fact checkers, and set up standards and codes of conduct. So it works on all levels, going from the national and the organizational all the way down to the individual. Just to give some examples of how this works, and I think we actually are looking at a lot of the same pieces. Brazil, is always, I think, a major focus of a lot of these efforts, and particularly the election cycle. This also showed, I think, the importance of closed networks and alternative networks. So looking at Telegram and WhatsApp have been very powerful there and are more difficult to moderate and manage. But also alternative networks like Parler and Getter, particularly out of the United States. I think you saw here the government and the organization of the campaign was really coordinated with the support of the state, and also influence operations that I would say were directed not by adversaries but potentially by allies, particularly again from the United States. The election management body, I think, to go back to that example, was very successful, I think, in engaging over time in developing media literacy and developing advertising around these issues, to talk about issues that they had encountered, to talk to people about how they can vote, about how the system is secure, and also about engaging with their audience and providing them with good information about how the election should go, where they can vote, and that kind of thing. And then working with civil society, with media, with academia on fact checking, research, and monitoring over time. I think this really holistic approach shines through there in particular. I think Nigeria was talked about some already, so I won't go too deeply into it, but this is a big one we're looking at in 2023. We will have an election observation mission with IRI as a joint mission. The legal challenges, I think, are problematic in different ways, and I think are causing problems and questions for the upcoming year. I think it's a similar case to Brazil, where we've been working for many years in the pre-election space since 2019 to build up that muscle memory, working with civil society groups, working with different partners globally, and particularly using regional elections and local elections as a way of building up those networks and that resistance, and providing opportunities to develop fact checkers in regional context, to work in local languages, to train local election management bodies, or talk with even security services about how they're managing these issues, and build up capacity on all fronts. And so really building that over time and not seeing it as something that's very limited by the election period itself. I think what you're seeing in a lot of cases is these things spin up very quickly and not having time to develop real responses. So I think at the same time, it's something where you need to think, and this is a map on the right here of kind of the infrastructure that's been developed and the access that has been built so quickly for people. I think what doesn't come with it at the same time is that information and media literacy. And so how do you build that? Sometimes it can be discrete educational programs that are built for particularly young people, but how do you reach older people? How do you reach people outside of those educational systems that may not have the money to participate in them? And I think a lot of them are about building affordances into the technical systems themselves. So working with the platforms so that they have good information and that their algorithms are structured in a way so they provide information about, say, the elections process naturally, or provide fact checks that are embedded in the system, but also thinking about how you can teach people about these processes while they're using the systems, and not something where it's sitting through a course, but rather as you use them, you're understanding about fact checking and other things. I think I wanted to close with Ukraine because, for many years we've been looking at this at NDI, and I think everyone can recognize it as a context where a foreign influence campaign sponsored by a government has had huge impacts there, but also how they've developed really strong responses. And working with civil society groups, NDI's built a hub of groups working in that context that are coordinating around research and response and monitoring in different ways, and really exchanging information and working together to do these kinds of things in coordination, and to engage in reporting on platforms, and even working with certain public sector groups. The war has really, I think, increased these threats. But at the same time, you've really seen a success, I would say, and the success is unfortunately borne out by the threats that you see from Russia and from the invasion, where the democracy is so vibrant and has provided a real opposition that is no longer captured by state interests, even from the Russian government, where you've seen an alternation of power, where you've seen a strong debate system, and also the influence of the European Union and some of those transnational standards in terms of developing an accession process to the EU, and understanding how they're trying to build a system that is truly democratic and a liberal democracy. So I think while Ukraine is a very problematic case, it's also, I think, a very important one to show where democratic standards can be fortified and can be strengthened in different ways, even in the face of these really strong threats. So that's something that we'll be working on, and I think certainly is one to watch and to study if you want to get into these subjects and kind of understand all the different components, whether you're looking at civil society, how the government works, the public sector, and the role of the platforms in moderating that space in different ways, anywhere from the Googles and the Metas of the world to the platforms even that are controlled by the Russian state. So very interesting case, I think really important one to watch, and one that we'll be working on very, very carefully in the coming years. Thank you, and I think I'll wrap it there.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you all three for your wonderful presentations. And actually, with your last slide and case, you answered one of the questions that I had, which was, if we were to think about a model case that we would like to imitate or that we would like to see taking root in other parts of the world, which one would it be? It seems like you have to align so many incentives for these things to work out neatly, incentives of platforms, government, civil society, and so you were talking about some of the progress made in Ukraine and some European countries. But so let me, I have a couple of questions. So one about media literacy, internet literacy. I was wondering about ideas for talking about social media and the decline of democracy with teenagers who are soon to be voters. This is definitely a question about individual agency and individual spheres of influence versus having an influence in the larger forums that have been talked about already today. So how to think about these issues when raising young voters or people who are going to be engaging in politics very soon and who have been socialized in these environments. And then another question that I think was, we're waiting for it. What do you think about regulating Twitter in order to prevent disinformation? And furthermore, the access to data that Dr. Bradshaw was talking about. How do we move on now that maybe the main source of data provision seems to be in a transition? So how do we move forward with data collection and transparency as well?
I can go first. I can jump in here. Maybe I'll jump in on the media literacy question.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I get asked questions about media literacy, I also like to say, like, I think it's something that really needs to be lifelong, not just something that we teach in schools to young people, because older people also share a large swath of mis and disinformation. So it's not just like a young person problem, but I think it's something that, you know, increasingly we need to make investments in schools as part of our general education growing up, but then think of strategies kind of outside of the classroom too. And how do we continue to instill a lot of good, solid media and digital literacy skills to the wider population? I also think that, you know, while media literacy is important, it's not necessarily fair to put the entire responsibility for this problem onto the user, because I think there are large systemic forces like platforms and the way that their algorithms push and prioritize certain kinds of narratives and stories to people that make it hard for users to actually thrive in this kind of environment. If our attention is constantly being pulled towards rumor and scandal and negative political coverage, opposed to, you know, having an environment where we can actually debate topics in a meaningful way, get access to good quality information. So, you know, while media literacy is an important part of it, I think that we also really need to think critically about the role of platforms in creating these environments that are so detrimental to democracy.
I might hop in here with a two-finger, if I may. You know, I think Dr. Bradshaw outlined some really important points here. I think the sort of flip side of that coin is that we're talking about social problems here. We're talking about problems that are not distinctly manifesting in the digital sphere. And so when we talk about social problems, we also need to acknowledge that this requires a whole of society approach, not necessarily one that's tailored entirely to the platforms. You know, I think we've spoken at length about some of the real problems and possible solutions to sort of platform manipulation and disinformation in the digital age. If we take a step back, this also requires, I think, more holistic investment in schools, in media literacy, in the social structures that form the building blocks of democratic participation. And that is not, you know, something that only tech companies and governments should be leading on. This is, you know, every part of our society needs to be turning to these issues of fidelity of information and sort of the trust in democratic processes, because the efforts to undermine both of those things are happening both offline and online. I think this issue of talking to young people is a really important one. And I think one thing we need to acknowledge too, that we've been speaking here largely about sort of the traditional social media platforms. Young people get their information in really diverse ways on the internet. And these days, short form video platforms are where young people are. And so I think I'll put a pin in that and say, I'm not equipped to provide tailored research on this because, that's not what my organization does. I think there's some really innovative work about information integrity on TikTok, on these short form video platforms. And I think that's one starting point maybe for this conversation.
Well, I don't know, we're running out of time. It's 12 already. I'm very sorry. I mean, there are other questions that were very interesting as well to discuss. We will have to get together again, I think, for further conversation. So I wanted to thank you all very much for your time, your input, your thoughts, your knowledge, and for sharing all of that with us and the audience. I want to invite the rest of the people who are joining us today for the next event that is going to be held in person at SIS. Professor Lauren Carruth will speak with experts on the migration crises in and out of the Horn of Africa. And here we see a slide about that event.